Hi, this is Paul, and this is Rough Draft for Sunday, where I walk through the current status of my sermon for Sunday. Last week we looked at Jonah chapter 1 and 2. We talked a little bit about Northrop Frye's narrative diagram of pretty much every story in the Bible and the Bible itself. We looked a little bit at Joseph Campbell's monomyth, or the hero's journey, and we looked at this with respect to Noah, and we asked the question, is Noah the hero of the story? Now the story continues in chapter 3. At the end of chapter 2, quite famously, the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon the dry land. Now, one of the things that we often gloss over are the details. Now notice that the Lord spoke to the fish, and the Lord has been speaking to Jonah. So right away in the story, there's a little bit of parallelism and questions about, well, the fish obeys the Lord. Well, what about Jonah? Well, Jonah, then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time, saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it the message that I tell you." And Jonah began to go into the city, going a day's journey. After he began to go into the city, going a day's journey. And he called out, "Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown." And the people of Nineveh believed God. They called for a fast and put on sackcloth, from the greatest to the least of them. Now, believed here is an interesting word because it's obvious what it means in context, but it's interesting because it brings us back to Jonah. The fish obeyed God. Jonah the first time disobeyed God. Did Jonah believe God? Is Jonah's issue really one of belief? Now, it's quite interesting. I'm not going to get into the whole very debated question for a very long time about, is this a parable? Is this story let's set that all aside there, because the story doesn't raise those issues. But there's a lot of questions. Well, you know, so let's say you project this into a realistic frame at least, so whether parable or not parable. Why would these Ninevites believe a prophet? Well, it's very interesting that the Hebrew prophets were a little bit different from the prophets, and we have prophets from those other civilizations in terms of the kinds of things that they majored in. The other prophets usually majored in indictments, usually about cultic matters left undone. And I've mentioned this in previous videos. Most of the prophets in Babylon and Nineveh had made indictments against the people or the king because they have failed to build a temple sufficient to whatever God's glory, or they have failed to be faithful in the sacrifices. The Hebrew God had a far fuller view of things and actually had this covenant which went quite a bit into people's lives and went quite a bit into how they should behave and how this God of them wanted life to be in the world, not only with respect to relationship with this God, which the other prophets were focusing on when they focused on cultic matters, but with respect to the life of the people and the overall value of the community and the way that people related to one another. Now, if you get into the question of, well, how deeply have we in the West been impacted by the Bible, the Old and the New Testament, this is another example of it, that we ourselves, even in secularity, we ourselves see the importance of the relationship to one another, whereas in the ancient world, the gods, yeah, you can treat everybody like crap, but as long as you pay your taxes, then you'll be okay with me. But not for the Hebrew God. Now we might say, well, why would the Ninevites believe God? Well, actually, as John Walton here points out, the text only indicates that the Ninevites believed the message of impending doom that Jonah delivered. And then he goes on to give other parallel examples, and that the Ninevites would likely have confirmed this with other divination procedures. And this, of course, gets a little bit complicated because we know how the Hebrews felt about these unsubscribed to divination procedures. But if you read the book of Kings and the book of Samuel, these kinds of things seem to have continued to go on, even though they were specifically against the law. But you should also note in the book of Jonah that earlier in the story, the pagan sailors practiced divination and the lot turned to Jonah. Now, what I'm not doing now is endorsing all of these divination procedures, but this is consistent within the frame of the story, that we might imagine that Jonah goes into the city, pronounces destruction, and the king then, calls out his wise men, something that you might read, for example, in the book of Daniel, where you'll find these kinds of things. And so Jonah's prophecy gets confirmed even by the pagan divinizers. And so, well, then suddenly the king goes on a full court press. Now the Ninevites, again, wouldn't necessarily ask why they were being destroyed, but the literature indicates in Mesopotamia that they knew this all the time. They didn't think they had to be told. The gods didn't need to justify their actions to the people. And as you can see in this one prophecy from in a lamentation over the fall of the city of Ur, Sin, the pagan deity of the city, asked why it was overthrown, and the answer given by Enlil, the head of the pantheon, basically says the gods have their judgment, can't be turned back. All you people out there, you little people out there, you're just ants before the bulldozer. I'm sorry, you have nothing to say in the matter. Well, the word of the king reached Nineveh, and he rose from his throne and removed his robe and covered himself with sackcloth and sat in ashes. And he issued a proclamation and published it through Nineveh. By the decree of the king and his nobles, let neither man nor beast, herd nor flock taste anything. Let them not feed or drink water, but let man and beast be covered with sackcloth, and let them call out mightily to God. Let everyone turn from his evil way and from the violence that is in his hands. Who knows? God may turn and relent and turn from his fierce anger so that we may not perish. And so the king of Nineveh, not unlike the pagan sailors that we saw last week, is in many ways acting appropriately. And so now, once again, we're invited to the contrast. Last week we saw the contrast between the pagan sailors and Jonah, who is the prophet of the Lord from God's chosen people, didn't look so good. And now we see the king and Jonah. And the king, like the pagan sailors, seems to act appropriately to the word of the Lord, unlike, again, Jonah, God's chosen person of God's chosen people for this mission. And then one of the most interesting verses in the story, which I rendered in 3 different English translations, the ESV, which is the newest. When the Lord saw what they did, how they turned from their evil way, God relented of the disaster that he had said he would do to them, and he did not do it. Now, I remember first translating this from Hebrew when I was in seminary. This is one of the first Hebrew books we read in Hebrew, because it's a nice, short, compact book with a limited vocabulary. And I was reading along, and the KJV renders this translation. And God saw their works, that they turned from their evil ways, and God repented of the evil that he had said he would do unto them, and he did not do it. What? God repented of evil? What does that mean? So you go to a Jewish translation that doesn't have all of the machinery, at least of Christian theology, but you'll have Jewish theology probably built in through the biases and assumptions of the translators there. God saw what they did, how they returned back from their evil ways, and God renounced the punishment he had planned to bring upon them. But this word that is used, the origin of the root seems to reflect the idea of breathing deeply. Hence the physical displays of one's feeling, usually sorrow, compassion, and comfort. And that begins to account for this strange translation. And the translation even has us imagine God seeing their repentance, probably yet knowing farewell, as does Jonah, that today they're going to put on sackcloth and ashes, and today they're going to get all religious, and today they're going to be all serious, and even in the moment sincere about it. But they're Ninevites, and they're going to go back, and they're going to do the heinous things that Ninevites are going to do. But God yet sees their act of contrition and breathes deeply and turns from his path. What does this do for our theology? What does this do for our assumptions about what God should and shouldn't do? What does this do for all of the scaffolding that we have placed around God in terms of all of the theology that we have developed so that we can decide what God will do. Does this bend Jonah's theology? Well, we're going to get to Jonah's theology a little bit later. You know, the King James translates the niffle of, repent 38 times. But this is mostly used of God's actions. People turn. That's the word that shub is what is used. Now there's no vowels in NHM, which, the vowels are different, and I won't go there in terms of Hebrew language. But unlike man, who are under the conviction of sin, feels genuine remorse and sorrow, God is free of sin. Yet the scriptures inform us that God repents, and actually this isn't the only place that this happens. In Genesis 6, when there's the flood, and Exodus 32, and Judges 2, and Samuel 15, God turns. And so the king, didn't have a bad idea. Now this displeased Jonah greatly, and you would imagine, well, shouldn't Jonah feel like, validated and vindicated in his prophetic role? And now he didn't really go there to be an evangelist because, we're going to find out now, he did not want this to happen. He was counting on these horrible Ninevites continuing to be horrible Ninevites. He prayed to the Lord saying, "O Lord, isn't this just what I said when I was still in my own country?" Oh, the editors of the book left that out, didn't they? They're telling this story so that we can have dramatic buildup. Well, what's at the core of this story? The core of the story is still Jonah. It's Jonah and God. And who is God? And how Jonah feels about God. "Oh Lord, isn't this just what I said when I was still in my own country? That is why I fled beforehand to Tarshish. This is why I was fleeing from your face, and your face showed up as a tempest. For I know that you are compassionate and gracious God." Wait, this is the God of the Old Testament. This is the God of Israel. This is the God that gets all this bad PR about, he's a difficult character and he's really something. And Jonah's saying, no, he's too soft. Slow to anger and abounding in kindness, repenting from evil he's about to do against people who deserve evil. Please, Lord, take my life, for I would rather die. Remember how he wanted the sailors to throw him in? Not willing to take action. Now he wants God to do him in. He doesn't want to deal with this God anymore. Now we're reading an Old Testament book where ideas about the afterlife are not terribly well developed yet. But he's trying to flee from God's presence. What is the story about? He does not want to be with God. He wants away from this God. Why? Because in Jonah's world, Jonah is the judge over heaven and earth, and Jonah is the arbiter, and Jonah should be large and in charge. And if Jonah had fire and brimstone and lightning and flood and earthquakes and tsunamis, Jonah has no question about what he would do to Nineveh. His problem is with God. Is he the hero? Has he changed? Is he really the master of both worlds? Jonah's issue is that he's not master of any world but his own judgments. And here's the thing. We sit in moral judgment over God. And we do it all the time. And we do it from our armchairs. And we do it in our minds. And you might say, well, we ought not to do this. And yeah, we'd certainly better be careful of it, but this isn't new. Then the Lord said, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sin is so grievous that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. This is what God tells Abraham. And so the men turned away and went toward Sodom, but Abraham remained standing before the Lord. Then Abraham, I think actually it's reversed. I should hang on. I gotta do a little bit more work here. Oh, nuts. Sometimes this cursor doesn't. There we go. You might notice that I switched around the word order in verse 22, and I did so because this little text note that I put down there. You can find that text note in the NEB translation. But there's this big debate over verse 22, who's standing before whom, because this is an interesting passage, because Abraham, in a sense, takes the role of the judge and says, then Abraham approached him and said, will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? And so here's an interesting thing where God never renounces his position. He can't. He can't cede it to us. But like a father with a son, like a parent with a child, engages in conversation with us about these things. And so God does this with Jonah. And so what is this book about? This book is about everything that matters. This book is about moral judgment. Book is about doing right. And this book is about us complaining against God because we think we know the way this world should run, and God isn't cooperating. I'm using the LEB, which uses Yahweh instead of the Lord. And Yahweh said, is it right for you to be angry? Notice God's posture towards Job. Job, what was all of this story about? You going to Nineveh and being overturned? And was it about the Ninevites? Surely. Is that more important than little Job? Or little Jonah? Well, I don't know, is it? Depends where you're standing and who's in the focus. Jonah's pretty important to Jonah. Nineveh's pretty important to the Ninevites. The sailors are pretty important to the sailors. Look at how this book works at different levels. And Jonah went out of the city and sat down east of the city and made for himself a shelter there. And he sat under it in the shade, waiting to see what would happen with the city. So Jonah's kind of like the king of Nineveh. But what is Jonah looking for? The king of Nineveh is looking for release from justice. Jonah's looking for justice. But is justice what we think it is? What kinds of judges are we? Well, let's introduce a new situation. So Yahweh God appointed a plant, and he made it grow over Jonah to be a shade over his head, to save him from his discomfort. Notice the words. To save him from his discomfort. There's a lot of salvation. Salvation belongs to the Lord, right? So God is now saving Jonah from his discomfort, and Jonah was very glad about the plant. Jonah's at the center of his little world here, and he loves this little plant. And now suddenly, Jonah's judgments are different. But now God is the bringer of all things here. Those of you watching the Jordan Peterson stuff, this is God number one, who's the bringer of all things, but also God number two, someone who talks to us, someone we can debate with. So God appointed a worm at daybreak the next day, and it attacked the plant, and it withered. And when the sun rose, God appointed a scorching east wind, and the sun beat down on Jonah's head, and he grew faint. Well, what about Jonah's judgments now? And he asked that he would die. Isn't that what he asked for before? And said, my death is better than my life. What kind of a judge is Jonah? Is this the kind of person we want judging the world? Is this the kind of person who should judge over Nineveh? What is this book about? Is Jonah the hero? So God said to Jonah, is it right for you to be angry about the plant? Remember, he just asked this question before. Is it right for you to want this city destroyed? And he said, it is right for me to be angry about the plant. Remember what's going on here. C.S. Lewis says that the door to hell is locked from the inside. Oh, what does this mean? Does this mean there is no hell? Or does this mean that hell is something we choose freely? That when it comes right down to it, we either want God and want God to be God, or we want to be God. Well, that's a choice. But Yahweh said, "You are troubled about the plant, for which you did not labor nor cause it to grow, O little self-centered piece of the universe, little imagined center of the universe. It grew up in a night and it perished in a night. And should I not be concerned about Nineveh, the great city, in which there are more than 120,000 people who do not know right from left, plus many animals? Oh, it's going to get good now." Except the book ends. And it ends on a question. Well, why does it end on a question? Well, maybe this is the question. Maybe this is the question we need to answer. Now, I normally hear two complaints. I hear, a good God would not tolerate this much evil in the world. He's soft and negligent. This is Jonah's complaint. Then I hear others say, the God of the Bible shouldn't be so picky about other people's behavior. This is something we usually say when other people's behavior aren't bothering us. If it's bothering us, well, suddenly we want God on our side, and we want God to bring it, to bring the fire and brimstone and hail and condemnation. And it's most often when we're not suffering from anything that we kind of have an easy, what's my word? Kind of have an easy mercy towards others when life is going nice for us. But when life is bad, we want the other way. We want God to use his power to mirror our values and our judgments, but we hate the thought of others having power over us. All this talk about power today. They're using power, as if no one should have power. Oh no! We want power to be used by us, which means we want to be the arbiters of the universe. We want to be God. Jonah wants deliverance from his miseries, but he wants misery for his enemies. This goes back a long ways. Plato's Republic begins. They're trying to define justice. It's actually not quite justice as we have in English. It's justice and righteousness. They're trying to decide what goodness is. They're trying to figure out what it means to be a moral human being, what it means to be righteous, what it means to make judgments, what it means to pass judgment on the world. And so, and what is it that justice gives, and to whom? Socrates is leading them in a dialogue. If Socrates, we are to be guided by all the analogies and preceding instances, then justice is the art which gives good to friends and evil to enemies. This is our answer. But who is God? And why is Jonah angry? He's the God who relents, the God who repents, the God who listens. But God can't keep doing this. No, and he won't. We like this when we see ourselves as needing relief from justice, but not our enemies. Who suffers when God relents? God does. God sees our suffering. God sees others suffering. This is all about these balances of suffering and justice and all of the issues that never leave us. What does this look like? What story could capture such an ideal? How could we ever imagine God wouldn't exclude himself from suffering, but himself come and become our victim? Because any God with credibility would have to say that. This is a quote from a Tim Keller sermon. Believe it or not, Albert Camus understood this. In this amazing piece of writing, Camus says almost the exact same words here. Christ, the God-man, suffers too. Evil and death can no longer be entirely imputed to him, since he suffers and dies. The night on Golgotha is so important because the divinity ostensibly abandons its traditional privilege and lived through to the end, despair included, the agony of death. So God leaves Jonah with a question. It's Interestingly enough, very similar to the question that the Jesus' most famous parable, the parable of the prodigal son, also ends with. And the parable of the prodigal son deals with exactly the same situation as the book of Jonah in many ways. In Luke 15, Jesus tells a story of two brothers. One is rebellious and the other dutiful. And you notice throughout the story of Jonah, we've got Jonah in contrast with the pagan sailors, Jonah in contrast with a pagan king. Who is righteous? In the end, the question is for the dutiful brother. And the decision whether he will join the party at the end of the story or he will remain the God of judgment, where he himself stands outside and judges God with all the other evildoers. What's that a definition of? It's a definition of hell. So who are you in the story? Is Jonah a hero? What is Jonah's issue? Assyria will destroy Israel. Babylon will destroy Nineveh. Who inherits the earth? Who can suffer like God to participate in the reconciliation of God? This is a story about heaven and hell. This is a story about, finally, can you stand God? Or will you remain judge over all the earth and your neighbors and their animals? Who finally participates in the great party at the end of the story? Who wants to be there? Jonah, the elder brother, you,